Owen is the writer behind the RaymondKHessel blog and YouTube channel, focusing primarily on general philosophical and psychological critique of a world ruled by the last man and the stance of human beings as Homo economicus. So Owen, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I mean, we can sort of go in a lot of directions with this, but I think we're going to generally stick to the short essay you put out on what you call psychopolitics.
Yeah.
If possible, like what does psychopolitics mean?
See, that's the problem. I have a really hard time defining it in a simple paragraph or sentence. I suppose, I mean, the term is used by many different people. I'm not that knowledgeable of how it's been used before. I'm picking it up mainly off Peter Sloterdijk, German philosopher, who is a kind of anti-humanist philosopher. So he's kind of looking at theories of the psyche or theories of mind which influence politics in a kind of general sense, in perhaps ways which a kind of simple technocratic or kind of rationalistic attempt to, I suppose, act politically fail to account for, we could say.
I think Sloterdijk's also a really interesting direction to go here, because he's someone who I've not read basically, and sort of off the back of your writing, I've sort of, he's made his way onto my reading list. But maybe we could start there. So you say he's anti-humanist. In what way is he anti-humanist?
Well, I suppose just a general definition of humanism would be something like humans as the rational center of the universe. So I would say his one of his works is very good. It's called Rage and Time, and he basically looks into this idea of thumos. So the Platonic soul is split between eros, reason, and thumos, and he looks at thumos, and thumos deals a lot with concepts of recognition, rage, ressentiment, as like something Nietzsche picked up on, obviously. And he basically looks at the different influences which rage in particular has had over, particularly the 20th century, our own time as well. And how, I suppose, the introduction to that book is very good, because he goes into the end of history. He kind of goes into this idea of Homo economicus. He goes into the critique of psychoanalysis, putting eros as the primary kind of life force. And he goes, the book is basically just showing how we've completely misunderstood this element, this kind of faculty, or this element of human beings. It's kind of a psychological idealism of human beings, and see how they influence and are reflected in general political and ideological phenomena.
Yeah, I think the psychological way is probably the best way to think about it, because, like you said, this idea of a Platonic soul is obviously, well, I would arguably say it's one of the roots of the sort of later Christian influenced philosophies, whether that's Christian humanism or I'd say later on, like, political egalitarianism definitely has its roots in those sorts of basing the view of the world on the individual human subject. And it's interesting how although that's not, I wouldn't say that's an entirely negative influence, it definitely has a part in the reactions to it in the 20th century and later on.
I think one good example of a reaction to, we could say, a kind of humanistic reaction to phenomena which emerges, which we could say unravels or shows some of these concepts that have been long forgotten, was the reason of new atheism to 9/11. So you have suddenly this kind of zealously religious, willing to die for a cause phenomena, and you have this kind of reaction of like pure hyper rationalistic sort of like quite punitive, quite quite reductive reaction. And then like this also kind of you could say coalesces with the obsession with things like brain sciences. So the move from psychoanalysis to cognitive, behavioral, and brain science orientated concepts. I think that there's a general kind of attempt to, we could say, see the human mind, see the psyche in a very easily mapped, without any kind of missing parts, without any ambiguities, without any kind of unpredictabilities, in order to then like I think there's a kind of like security ideology which is nearly embedded in our kind of cognitive and neurological theories of mind. If we can predict and understand human beings, so these events which happen, which kind of remind us that we failed to properly understand, can somehow be treated or something. I'm not sure, but yeah.
And it's interesting how that sort of rationalism has sort of evolved into an assumptive materialism. Now, when it comes to metaphysics, maybe materialism is true, right? But you'd be a fool to say that something supernatural, like the metaphysics of Islam, like the belief of Islam, doesn't have it has like a downstream influence, like whether that's metaphysically true or not. It definitely has like an important and central influence on the way humans think.
Yeah, I mean, I think our responses to people that really believe is part of our belief. It's not just you believe this and I believe that. The way we respond to people that really believe and do things with belief that maybe might shock us is part of our own belief, we could say.
Yeah, it's strange actually. Yeah, because there is sort of and it's interesting as well, because like you said, the assumption of the human as a fundamentally economically based unit, not only in its utility but also in its interest, right? Like the assertion from the West is that, well, look what happens when we economically became better off. We became more secular, we became all these things, and that sort of prediction isn't a foregone conclusion and hasn't necessarily shown itself to be true, to be honest with you.
Yeah, that really reminded me of this book by Albert Hirschman. It's called the Passions and the Interests, and it's a good book where he describes how a lot of the economically determined, centralized, kind of economically central thinking was in many ways an attempt to try reduce humans to something which, as long as it's in their interest and they're not acting out of kind of wild passions, which confuse us and we kind of fail to predict and control, as long as they're acting in interest, we don't really mind how they behave, so long as it's in their interest. It reminds me of this scene in Game of Thrones where Tyrion, I think he's talking about something, and he says, "Oh, the reason he's got, Tyrion is actually a kind of very Machiavellian character, so he figures out people's interests, and then he can kind of predict what they're going to do, and this is what makes him so useful and so kind of I suppose kind of politically savvy. He's obviously a dwarf, so he's not like physically imposing. He's not a warrior, but he's quite politically savvy. And then the funny thing is, at the end of that story, what happens? The person that he thought he could predict burns everything down. So it's like this kind of it's a good analogy actually for the failure in, I think, thinking in this way where everything can be reduced to people's interests. Some people can you can predict things in this very Machiavellian, economically determined manner. Of course, I mean, in general, you probably can predict a lot with it, but there's always this gap. And I think it's how we think. Going back to the thing about 9/11, I think it's how we've reacted in the 21st century to this gap, to this strange, unpredictable void of the other. We could say that I think has informed a lot of our security state, obsession with data, obsession with kind of behavioral psychology, and so on.
Is that the same Albert Hirschman of Voice, Loyalty, and Exit? or Voice, Exit, and Loyalty.
It is, yeah. I haven't read that one, but it is the same.
No, I haven't read the one you mentioned. I think Voice, Exit, and Loyalty is quite a big influence on me in terms of I really admire the fact that it's not trying to be necessarily so objective, and it's kind of more like a mental model. But it's interesting because there is overlap there, because in a lot of ways it says, well, there's always like a cost benefit analysis that goes into whether you exit an organization, whether you voice your concerns, and this applies to states and not just companies. It applies to states and clubs with initiation, any club with initiation, basically. And one of his central points is basically that there is a certain factor of irrational loyalty. There is. I think, and I've had a lot of people disagree with me on this because they think it applies to literal institutions like groups of people, but I feel like people have the same feeling about ideas as well, and the same economy happens with ideas, because people have it forms part of people's identity, right? If your identity is that you're a Christian, voice, exit, and loyalty are actually options in that identity.
Yeah, no,
it doesn't fit into a rational model at all, because the reason why you can, some people, like there's a high proponent of martyrs with religious belief is because there's a high amount of that irrational loyalty there.
Yeah, that's a very good example. I haven't read that specific book, but I think I've heard the kind of summaries on it, and it often deals with that. And it's this kind of I think it's a good example today where you have, I think, a lot of like large bureaucratic managerial institutions who kind of spiral out of control. I mean, if you've kind of seen this in the past 5 years or so, I mean, you kind of see it with like corporate, like very kind of centrist, politically thinking, technocratic organizations and corporations to suddenly adopt like hyper progressive, hyper woke rhetoric and ideology, and you kind of wonder, how on earth did this happen? You would think that would reoperate within the kind of standard framework, that organization. Yeah, it's a very good point.
I think the most interesting thing about large institutions or large corporations sort of incorporating things like wokeness, for example, which in a lot of ways decades ago is seen as like quite a revolutionary thing. And the same goes for things such as Brexit, for example. And you see an institution like the Conservative Party sort of like adopting that and castrating it, basically. And that's essentially what's been done with wokeism, because you see it with people who are possessed by that ideology, is that they're now siding with BlackRock and the big financial companies, along with the large pharmaceutical institutions as well.
Yeah, I think that it's definitely something that we've really failed to really understand, is how these irrational beliefs kind of do actually function within these institutions. Like as you're saying, it's they seem to function anyway in a kind of filtering sense. There seems to be a filtering process of like I think the left is a good example of this, how it's operated over in the past 10 years. There's been like, you talk to people who used to be on the left, they all feel like they've been like, it's not that there's been a destruction of this idea of this political group or ideology, but there's been a filtering out. There's certain elements are kept in, certain elements are pushed back. When I was talking to Joshua Hansen, we were talking about the abandonment of Foucault. Like, why wasn't in the past 2 years Foucault like the absolute prophet of the kind of the biopolitical themes and so on the left? Well, it's because they just kind of pushed that aspect. And kept what they wanted to, which brings us into kind of this theme of one of the things I mentioned in the essay, was this kind of risk of like preferable ideologies. We kind of pick and choose our ideologies. We pick and choose which part we want, which part we want to leave out. Whereas I think the traditional ideological view was much more, I think if your idea of progress is really embedded strongly in this kind of idea of historical stages and historical progress, I think that you're not able to be as selective consumer orientated when you pick which aspects to keep in and out. You kind of have to adopt the overall framework and kind of move with it. But I think today there's this interesting phenomenon which happens when you go from theory to practice. So you have like theory of historical progress or anti-capitalism, Marxist critique, and then when you go into practice, all of a sudden you see this kind of strange neutering that's been going on, and then what actually happens in practice is a adoption of the ruling classes, ideological rhetoric and so on. So I definitely think there's a kind of motif there of we've really failed to understand how loyalty to a theory in practice actually operates within these large institutions.
I think another interesting example of that sublimation is, and this is particularly relevant to Joshua Hanson's work with the critique of the academy, is the sublimation of Nietzsche, essentially. Like, since he's sort of been in the Anglosphere, he's sort of been selectively picked and choose from, right? And, things like his misogyny and the fact that he's pretty much as right-wing as Julius Evola is like acknowledged, but for some reason, you have, left-wing academics writing about how, like, the left-wing aspects of Nietzsche, like, it's not even related to the original source text anymore. And it's absolutely bewildering. I don't understand how, with so many other things being cancelled, how a thinker like him, a writer like him, is still like pretty central to the syllabus. But it's because, these courses, they're not based on primary source material. They're based on secondary papers, essentially, on squabbles between individual academics.
Yeah, I remember doing a Nietzsche module at university, and I found it interesting that this was like, because we were reading things which were so politically incorrect. I was fascinated that for some reason this is acceptable, but much tamer critiques in other modules would have been like absolutely I think attacked. And I think maybe it's a little bit to do with like the image. We have to keep up the image of the kind of intellectually curious, kind of iconoclastic intellectual. And I think Nietzsche helps. It's possible that maybe Nietzsche helps these institutions keep up that image while actually, as you were saying, completely neutering the more potent aspects of them. Which, I mean, it's a question of like, is that worse? Like, would you rather just be censored? Yeah, would you rather just be ignored, or like to be embraced is nearly worse because you actually get kind of mutilated? Where if you're just censored, you're just ignored, and somebody may find you in some point, in some little niche or something, right?
Yeah, it's strange because I just the Nietzsche thing specifically is just so bewildering to me, because like he literally left these sorts of institutions for the reasons that we see the results of now. And again, it's used by these people to sort of align themselves with these genuinely great thinkers. It's sort of a weird appropriation. I'm not sure how I feel about it, but yeah, I know I wouldn't say I'm on the cancelling side of things. It just seems incredibly hypocritical. So anyway, so in your essay, you mentioned the to move past kind of the 20th century, we need new language, and you were particularly criticizing the word ideology, saying that it's not sufficient for what's required now. What can you give an example of that? What do you mean by that?
Well, I said, because first of all, you could have a very kind of vulgar Marxist view of like base superstructure, and ideology is just the kind of the superstructure. And then you can have a more like I think Zizek kind of tried to flip that a little bit with his view, like introducing elements of psychoanalysis and so on into his ideological critique. But I think how do I put it? Like the endless critique of ideology is kind of part of ideology today, right? This endless, never-ending critique of everything, I think, is probably like one of the most ideological forms. there's kind of, I think what the past 2 years in particular has reminded me of is that there's people that are constantly critiquing, when you actually get to a point where there's an opportunity to actually, I suppose, commit to a certain framework or a certain direction, a political direction or a political project, suddenly crumbles. I mean, you can think of, like, whether Sanders, Corbyn, all these left, and even Trump. I mean, like, when everyone started protesting outside of January 6th, whatever, he kind of just, you'd think this would be like, this is almost like the kind of like Trump moment, the historical moment, that he kind of just went, oh, this is crazy, we have to ban this. So there's this kind of inability, I think, to really commit to or stick with a political project and pick a direction to go in, which ideological critique is a good example of. And I also think it's part of the problem, like going back into this idea of putting theory into practice. I think there's a problem with the failure to understand that whenever we're doing this, whenever we're putting theory into practice, we're never 100% sure of what's happening. We always have this kind of epistemic limit, we could say. I think Hobbes, as much as I disagree with Hobbes on many things, I think what he got really right in his kind of critique of rationalism was that you have to make a jump. You have to kind of make that leap of faith towards choosing, for example, a leader, choosing, for example, a sovereign. So when this moment, if you put this in the framework of the left, for example, I remember Corbyn was often saying, just at the height when he nearly got elected, he was saying, this isn't my movement, this is our movement. And I was kind of saying, I was kind of thinking, this isn't good, because what he's actually doing is basically kind of turning away from the edge as you get close to it. He's saying, no, we don't really have to pick anything. We don't really have to choose a direction to go, and we can just kind of like walk to the edge and then suddenly turn back. And I kind of think there's the same kind of theoretical problem. That's like perhaps a more pragmatic analogy of like the theoretical problem with ideological critique. It kind of critiques and gets to this point, and then it doesn't know where to go. So then transforms itself into ideology.
Yeah. I think there's an interesting parallel with Trump as well, because, the guy being a media personality is very evident, because that same day he was all fire and brimstone for the audience and for the cameras. But as soon as sort of the realization of I think I would say the trap that his supporters had fallen into became obvious, he essentially abandoned them. And that hardcore group that stormed the Capitol were basically at the behest of the intelligence services at this stage, or in prison or whatever. And it's strange, because even they themselves, they're in the Capitol building, still respecting the velvet ropes for the most point, but not really knowing what to do. It wasn't exactly the storming of the Winter Palace, was it? They didn't go in and start signing orders to go and arrest senators, did they?
No, you're right. And
to borrow from Mark Fisher, there's almost a sort of democratic realism around the zeitgeist. We're so entrenched in, again, I'm calling it democratic realism, not because it's actually democratic, but because that's what people always defer to when they try and extol the virtues of neoliberalism or whatever the hell system we have now. And it's almost like people can't even get themselves outside of that frame. It's almost like we've become theoretical, so theorized, that any sort of idea of people of action is just completely unthinkable.
Yeah, I actually quite like that idea of democratic realism. It's quite good. It's almost like I think democracy to us today is basically an excuse to abandon a political project. Mm-hmm. It's just like we're not going there. And the other, and of course, the longer we abandon going anywhere, the longer we get stuck in the situation we are in today. I was thinking recently, what actually, all of this fear of going back to normal that we're seeing, and the people that are more or less, I think, in charge are, more or less still the kind of technocratic liberal, more kind of affluent liberal aspect of the Western demographic. And I think they're terrified of going back to normal, not because they genuinely are scared of a virus, because at this stage it's it's relatively safe. It's because they know populism is creeping up. They know they have no idea what to do, where to go. They know like there's threats around every corner. And so long as they can perpetuate a state of emergency, they can just kind of constantly indefinitely postpone. Postpone. It's not merely just them postponing just to prolong their power, but to postpone from them actually having to say, okay, the technocratic model is the only solution, is the way to go. I think it's becoming obvious that it's not the only solution. It can't be the solution anymore. But there's this kind of constant anxiety, as you were saying with the Trump example, when you actually get in the building. That example is obviously for more on the fringe, but the kind of more center example is like, how do we actually present this kind of technocratic model anymore justifiably? It's almost like if we actually do it fully, if we fully believe in our own ideology, it will just eventually just play out. And I think that without these constant states of emergencies, I think what you would see happen is populism, I think, around the West being just voted in. But with these states of emergencies, it's kind of constantly delayed. We don't really have the old world. We're not really in the new world. It's kind of like a purgatorial political state we're in at the moment, I think.
It definitely feels that way. I think, since the state of emergency, I was pretty black-pilled about it. I was like, okay, we're definitely in democratic realism now. We're not getting out anytime soon. I think, it'd be more proper to call it neoliberal realism, but it doesn't have quite the ring to it, does it? So, but basically, I think it's got its roots in and again, I think it's Christian, because it's the linear and progressive sense of history that these things are inevitable and are just going to happen anyway. So we have to embrace them. And, if there happen to be states of emergency, whether that's climate emergencies or biological emergencies along the way, there's just, we might as well, just use them to sort of move things along as fast as we can. And that's the psychopolitical side of it, is they're trying to keep people in that progressive, and I don't mean progressive in terms of, things getting better, but like, this is going to happen anyway, state of mind.
Yeah, no, that it's funny. I was planning on writing about this recently, but I was watching Slavoj Žižek's Pervert's Guide to Ideology the other a few days ago, and he has this great example of psychopolitics in there, where he says Jaws is, the film Jaws, where the shark comes in and terrorizes his little coastal town. Mm-hmm. He says the reason Jaws functioned as a film, and Fidel Castro had this idea that Jaws was like symbolic of capitalism, kind of terrorizing the small local people, kind of uprooting their daily life and so on. And his idea of Jaws was that it was basically like the shark stood for a multiplicity of fears and anxieties, which have kind of unified on this one object. So obviously the example you can use from the 20th century was fascism and the Jew. The Jew operated as a multiplicity of complex anxieties and fears, which kind of just psychopolitically unified around one object. So obviously the idea is you just have to get rid of that object and everything will return to normal, or everything will be good. And I kind of thought, like, this is exactly what our obsession with the virus is. This is exactly what it is. It kind of unifies all of these insecurities and anxieties and fears and a kind of declining sense of status and power. Obviously, I think with the kind of liberal technocratic fearing the rise of populism and so on. It kind of unifies all those fears, and if you can just deal with this, everything will stay the way it is. Everything will stay the way it is, which is interesting, obviously, because this is not what Zizek has done with his critique. He hasn't gone that far, but nonetheless, if you actually apply his own theories to the situation today, that's kind of what you would end up with. So I mean, I guess we could say that like psychopolitics kind of deals with this issue of like, we do like, if we really do want to start a political movement or go in a certain political direction, we do need to unify. This is what ideology does. This is why you can't necessarily get rid of ideology, because if you actually want to put things into practice, you do need to unify a multiplicity or kind of dispersed array of disillusionment, rage, fear, anxiety, and actually kind of give it form. So you can't really, it's not that you can't escape ideology because we're just all indefinitely superstitious and we haven't yet become enlightened. It's because when you actually go from theory to practice, you need this unification of kind of psychopolitical direction. You need to give it a form, and that's not rational. You can't reduce it. Like, of course, there's reason involved, but it can't be reduced to the rational alone.
Yeah, maybe I'd be good to hear your thoughts on this, but as we've been speaking of, it's become more, well, I've sort of put myself in the situation where I think that psychopolitics is essentially the story of the herd, right? Because for the examples you mentioned, whether it's an unforeseen danger or a scapegoat, I know very intelligent people who, and majority of people in this country, absorb this sort of stuff in school. When they learn about history, they learn about the scapegoats of history, they learn about the manipulations of governments. Yet when push comes to shove, and again, I'm not saying that I'm not superstitious in some ways, that I haven't been tricked by governments or companies or whatever, right, in some way, but when push comes to shove, not only do they, and again, myself included, fall for these things, even though the patterns and the layout of this actual, like this concretized threat follows the exact same pattern as it has done throughout history. Not only do they do that, but when it later becomes clear which parts of this were a myth, a lie, or just a mistake, they are incapable of reframing themselves or, admitting either authority at fault or even themselves are at some sort of fault. I found this with the majority. It seems like a very slim minority are actually able to reframe themselves and not look towards the current elite narrative to do that. And again, it's maybe you disagree with this, but it's making me more and more sort of elitist, not in the sense that there is an elite that should rise or whatever, but that psychopolitics is the story of this lumpenproll of humanity that is, whether it's a monarchy or a modern nation state or a religious cult, they're always, this lumpenproll mass are always controlled by these things. And I don't know, like we're looking at psychopolitics here, and again, if you agree with what I've been saying here, I don't know, it'd be interesting what you say, but is there an escape? Is there an escape? Is there any way, or do we just have to accept this, and then the game then is really, to get the psychopolitical narrative to be the one you like? Is that it?
Okay, that's the ultimate question, right? Because once we realize like pure kind of enlightened rationality, which there's no more illusions, and we're all just absolutely like this kind of democratic realism state you're talking about, which is also based in this obsession with data, right? I mean, like you were mentioning kind of the failure of leadership. What we do today when we have the failure of leadership is we don't say I made a bad political or ethical judgment. We say I didn't have sufficient data, so therefore my decision was wrong, but I will have sufficient data in the future. So we have this constant postponements and negation of actually accepting political responsibility. So, I think, but the problem is this is becoming more and more comical. I think people are becoming more and more aware that this isn't the case, and that you don't have this kind of a class of experts who really are like not ideological. They clearly are. So I think that there's this danger then once you go past the like you have this kind of technocratic stage of history where we believe in experts, we believe in kind of this democratic realism form, we believe in the data, the science, and then the more and more that unveils to be its own form of ideology. Not that it's totally not true, but it's bound up in it. As you were saying, the more and more the risk we have of like, well, if everything's ideology, then where do we go? Like, what do? We just pick whatever you want. I mean, why not? And that's the other side of total relativism. So that's the danger of falling into total relativism. And I think you see this you already see this kind of total relativism in things like political or gender or racial identities. You can just kind of change them every week. You see them even on Twitter of like, I don't know, like 22-year-old people from, San Francisco deciding they're going to be Catholic from now on. Like this kind of, it's kind of LARPing tendency comes in, because LARPing basically is that I just pick. So I guess the task is to accept that in some level we don't escape ideology. In some level, if we want to do anything political in practice, we must put it into form, which means going, like risking going back into the world of belief. But how do we have a framework then for doing that in a way which isn't just a kind of consumer choice of which illusion you want best, I suppose. So
yeah. I mean, I will pick you up on one thing you mentioned there, is that there's this risk of going back into belief. I would counter that and say that despite our pretenses, I don't think we ever truly left it. And I think there's obvious evidence for this. But one of the things that really stuck out to me when I was doing some research on the stuff you talked about in the essay is that we have this system, and again, this is going back to academia, the system of peer review, where things are checked or supposedly checked. And then, if a study shows, usually that's just someone reading the abstract and not actually reading the paper itself, then that's objective fact. That's what objective fact is, even though someone can go and, individually carry out an empirical experiment to prove something, or even show something to the contrary. The academic corporate media, which is peer-reviewed journals, is somehow a higher standard of truth than that. And one of the things that made me really think that like it's just a way of the academic, so therefore epistemological powers that be, as a mechanism to push what they want, in an oracle-like fashion, is the fact that peer review as a word, you look at the trend, like trends of usage. Peer review wasn't a word before 1960. Like, it wasn't a thing that people said. And so you're going to tell me that that the Manhattan Project wasn't done with some sort of objectivity. Like, there are different standards of objectivity, not just the academic one. And I think this is a real sort of psychopolitics, which is really powerful, because it, like I said, it's not just affecting the lumpenproles who, again, like I said, a news media article will say studies have shown so and so, and it's almost like a game of Chinese whispers going through the population. But not only that, but everyone up to and including academics believe something if it's got this standard of truth applied to it. And it's almost as if objective truth didn't exist before 1960.
This is like, we're seeing a lot of the conflicts that you previously had between, for example, Catholicism and Protestantism, in the, like, do you believe the church authority, or do you believe the Bible? Do you believe the king or the text? We're kind of seeing this now in, like, well, do you believe the credentialed official, or do you believe the individual sitting on watching YouTube videos or something? There's this substantially political element which is being reasserted into belief, which has reemerged, I think, quite drastically in the past few years. Like, I'm not really sure where to go with this. I think that like there's certainly a dialectic anyway, just between kind of dogmatic realism, credentialized realism, kind of dogmatic enlightened rationalism, and screw it, pick your illusion, why not? And there's also the risk, when that happens, of falling into kind of a more kind of totalitarian system, because if everything just become relative, and then someone's saying this is the way it is and that's the end of it, well, then you at that stage you may as well just go, oh, okay, So I suppose one of the things I tried to do in the essay was try frame things in terms of obviously Plato's Republic is a good example, because you have this you have an almost mythological kind of theory of the soul. So you have three parts to it. It's nothing is empirical, nothing is like scientific in the modern sense at all. It's bound up in this, in obviously a kind of belief of a harmonization of the soul, of these parts moving up towards the good. The analogy of the charioteer obviously is the kind of main kind of image that comes to mind here. And I suppose so here you have an example of something which is both, you know, not in any way a sort of vulgar empiricism, positivism, or a kind of obsession with biology. You kind of have this in like evolutionary theory. Everything can be explained through evolutionary biology. But at the same time, it aims at something that, like, it's not totally relative. It aims at something, right? Mm-hmm. And reflected in this structure of the soul is, of course, classes. You have a guardian class. You have a kind of more economistic class. You have you have a reason intellectual class. Now, of course, on some sense, this is ideological. This is like, well, you know, I can imagine someone critiquing this today and saying, well, you know, like there was a class structure in place in ancient Greece, and you just reified it by coming up with this theory of a soul. But at the same time, it aims at something. Like, it's not completely relative, of course. It aims at the good, and I think this is kind of what we fail to do in the modern world. We fail to actually kind of have, like, embrace belief in a certain sense, maybe a certain qualified sense, and actually actualize it politically, moving towards something which is real, true, better, in some like authentic, real sense. So this is exactly what I think is as we've ultimately failed to do in the modern world. And then obviously, do we just all just go back to Plato and just read Plato again? Well, that's probably not going to work either. But it's at least a kind of example of something that could be plausible.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and obviously that's the fruits of Plato's sort of, well, I'm going to say maybe someone will disagree on this, but the fruits of Plato's metaphysics. And I think that you see other places where to have a metaphysic almost implies an eschatology in the way you've described, you know, these parts transcending towards the good. If you give another example, you know, you're saying materialism, but to be more specific, empirical materialism, you know, it sees the world as what it is, as the appearances, and it also sees the world as a set of information, a set of as like propositional facts to be collected. And so you see this with the, you know, the proclamations that, you know, neuroscience is going to get so good in 10 years that, you know, we're going to know what's going to happen now in people's brains, and we know what's going to happen for the rest of time. And the problem with these eschatologies is that, you know, they're ascribing this utopia, this place where science is going to solve everything, and it's always 10 years away. It's always 10 years away. It's you know, it's almost like an ideology in that sense, where, you know, the perfect, once we get rid of all the dissidents, then, you know, the perfect society, the perfect communistic society is going to be 10 years away. Once we get rid of all these damn unvaccinated, you know, our utopia of freedom again is on the way. I think all these things are sort of implied in these viewpoints, and I'm very skeptical whether we can escape them. I think that's one of the messages of psychopolitics. I think I'm definitely on the pessimistic black-pilled side of this, to be honest. So you can comment on that if you want, but I do want to talk about what you said psychopolitics might be attempting to do, because this ties into the materialist stuff, but also I think what you're referencing is you're talking about the Marxist view of the insistent that the social, the political, and the historical are as a result of material conditions. That's all they are. They're completely as a result of material conditions. And what you say is that psychopolitics is a you know, it's trying to break out of that insistence that it's determinately linked in this way. So Could you elaborate on that, and sort of what other conditions are there that aren't material conditions?
Yeah. Yeah, no, just to comment on the other thing as well. There's this interesting, you were saying about this kind of scientific eschatology. Have you noticed that the destruction or the fading away or the failure of historical eschatologies, in the end of history and so on, has basically resulted in scientific eschatologies. We've said we can no longer embrace a kind of historical method of understanding the world and of moving towards a better state, progressing in this kind of evolutionary sense, not evolutionary but in a biological sense, but in a kind of more historical sense. That's turned into, okay, well, what can we do? There's this kind of anxiety, there's this openness, we don't know where to go, map the brain, collect data and so on. So there's this kind of totalitarian I think the kind of irony you were pointing out there was that we've seen historical utopias or any utopia as dangerous and inevitably leading towards totalitarianism, and then we kind of have this pessimism, and then what we do is we just come up with a scientific eschatology instead to replace that, which is equally as, maybe even more, open to kind of totalitarian control and so on. So yeah, we're in this complete deadlock. We don't know where to go. And like the point is, you can't escape ideology. Maybe we can't escape utopian thinking too. Maybe this just emerges in and of itself. So I can't remember your other question though after that, but
yeah, no, I think so you obviously, again, like I said, I really think these eschatologies are downstream from metaphysics in some way. But very early on, pretty much all eschatologies are religiously based, so they're based on a supernatural metaphysics essentially. And then, like you said, these come into more historical shape, more ideological shape, and those have failed now. And like you said, there was this like, okay, let's get objective about this, and it seems to have naturally disintegrated back into its sort of vulgar prehistoric form almost. It's become religious again. So I don't know if I'm asserting the Kali Yuga of the fact that we'll always come around, but I'm definitely asserting the sort of Blackpool position that I don't think we can escape those sorts of superstitions or narratives, really. But yeah, no, I was just picking up on the points that you say, oh, this is what psychopolitics attempts to do. And one of the first point was that to rebel against the insistence that all social, political, and historical phenomena is down the road from mere material conditions. I'm just wondering if that's a reference to sort of the Marxist view of things being determined in that way, and what you consider a condition that, what is an immaterial condition? What are the non-material conditions that could be considered as well?
Yeah, well, I guess, I mean, like, obviously we think of Marx when we think of material conditions because that word just has this kind of implication. But I would be attacking, I don't subscribe to historical materialism, but I also would even less subscribe to, evolutionary biology, but like all-encompassing evolutionary kind of biological theories, or anything really which we can kind of blueprint and map, whether it be history, whether it be biology, whether it can be like technological progress, and we can just merely abstract from that kind of framework and say this is the way, these conditions were how we got here, so therefore this is the way it's going to continue to go. I think this is clearly not, there's a clear theoretical failure here, which kind of comes back into the theory practice kind of contention. But the other conditions, I don't even know if you could have, if you could even call them conditions, because we're looking at kind of, I guess, symbolic forces like eschatology, like theories of human nature, theories of the soul, theories of the psyche, ideas of the good. Obviously, in Nietzsche, you have the idea of an Übermensch. So when he posited that humans were always driven by a kind of psychological ressentiment, that they always have to deal with this problem. This wasn't just merely a a scientific psychological observation of man or something. This was also a kind of starting point to then offer overcoming Übermensch and so on. So I suppose the conditions aren't really conditions. I think they're more just maybe it's more kind of Aristotelian idea of like potentialities, symbolic structures, ethical pursuits, and so on. These things, I do think these things determine world events to at least a much greater degree than they've been given credit for. I'm not saying completely, but to a much greater degree than they've been given credit for.
I think this does come back to what we've been speaking about in terms of superstition and narrative, because psychopolitics is almost about the symbolic conditions, because we're getting back to psychology, right? We're getting back to, you know, the discursive symbols of the way these things are communicated, and that, like I said, I was talking about metaphysical belief and martyrs and these sorts of things. It's quite clear that what influence, well, I would suggest that it's not material conditions that influence martyrs to take out the thing, to conduct the things they do. I think it's very much the power of symbolic conditions and psychic control over us that makes us humans capable of doing those sorts of things. I'm not sure if you would agree with that, but that's kind of what I think.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely true. I think there's always this, yes, of course we're influenced by our material conditions, but as you were saying, the potential to actually act in a certain way or respond to those conditions in a certain way can't be totally explained by the conditions themselves. I think that needs to be explained by more, more symbolic conditions, as you were saying, or potentialities or aspirations. Hobbes, for example, just go back to Hobbes. I think, he proposed three conditions for the state of nature. And I think these are good. Like, one is obviously resource, fighting over resource. So this is the kind of vulgar, material conditions. The other are diffidence, meaning insecurity, as in like, I don't know if you're going to attack me before I attack you, so I'm going to attack you first. So kind of epistemic in anxiety, we could say, about the reaction, which is in some way material and in other ways not material. And then the other one, which is the more obviously, well, they're both psychopolitical, but the other one is vanity or glory. So this kind of strange way humans behave. I think Hobbes even argued that we shouldn't translate the Greek Homeric texts into English because they're going to influence young men to kill their kind of political and social leaders and so on, because Achilles was obviously not, the most well-behaved character in ancient literature. So you have these influences which I think we are constantly dealing with, and I don't think, my other contention would, I think a lot of people would say, yes, we have these influences, but at some stage we will kind of, I don't know, evolve out of them or kind of socialize out of them, or kind of technologically repress them or something. I don't know if you saw recently, there was a article posted by a professor of bioethics, and this was like during the early stage of the lockdown, and they suggested that we don't just need a vaccine, we need a sort of moral pill which we can give the people who refuse to take vaccines and so on. So you have this kind of scientific repression of things which aren't just material conditions, because if it was just material conditions, it wouldn't be like, it would be more like, you don't need to do that. Like, all you need to do is just, incentivize it in some way, or, but you do have this kind of very cynical, like, acknowledgement that there are forces which are beyond, the kind of technocratic or economistic or biological control, which is kind of hope in a way, because I mean, it's a big problem for biopolitics, obviously, if there are aspects of humans which can't be controlled by kind of biological control or economic control. But it's also a kind of it acknowledges a failure to acknowledge these more symbolic forces which are at work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I think and I think you mentioned this, is that the modern psychopolitic, and I was gonna, we can use these ideological terms like say, oh, it's neoliberal, all this sort of stuff. But I feel like it's almost based around unity, which is kind of a weird bastardization of the socialist solidarity, I would say. In the sense that we all, should queue up and get the next medicine when it's our turn, and that sort of thing. It forms a really weird superstructure where the ideal is almost like an ant farm. I don't know how else to describe it, but it seems like it's the 21st century seems to want to make us into like a homogenized mush, and this applies to a lot of things. It's not just the unity in terms of biological security, but also this disintegration of the nation state when it comes to the forces of capital as well. It's not just a like a mush of pharmaceuticals, but it's also this ideal. And again, it's like there's pros and cons to this, but it's taken as a given that once the whole of humanity, all the visual things about us are homogenized, then it'll somehow be better. And I think this is, again, it's in the psychopolitics because, and again, this is something you see with other totalitarian ideologies where people are not only encouraged to inform on the people closest to them, but also almost informing on themselves. I feel like, at least in recent years, we've become our own community support officers, because I think that's something you can play into, because I feel like all of us, even the least conscientious, have a sort of internal busybody. Maybe that's a weird version of the conscience that, the one part that tells you, oh, just do it because it's the rules and that sort of thing. But yeah, I don't know. I think my opposition to it, and I think the Homeric poems are a really good example of this, because they're the complete opposite of that homogenized mush. They're all about conflict. They're all about differences. And not only that, but it's not about a sort of egalitarian and conformist virtue, which is exactly what we've seen. Like a hyperization of this in the last couple of years. But the Iliad's about anger. That's the virtue in the Iliad. It's what it opens with. It's all about Achilles' anger.
Yep. Yeah, it's funny you mention that, because going back to the Sloterdijk book, I mentioned Rage and Time. He opens with that. He opens with the very first line of the Iliad, and he says, of the rage of Achilles, and he's like, this is how Western literary culture started with pure rage. So it's interesting how much things have changed. But I guess, again, just on the topic of rage, you could see things like terrorism, school shootings, and stuff as a kind of strange reemergence of that. But like not a very positive reemergence of that, like a very negative one. But you mentioned this idea of unity, and there's actually something I thought of the other day, which was that we've replaced the old notions of solidarity, whether that be solidarity through class, through nation, with kind of ideas of kind of therapeutic conformity. Like we're kind of like, we're not unifying for this, again, for the sake of something more, higher, better. We're unifying for the sake of making ourselves more predictable and less threatening to the other. Like the other, we're obsessed with making ourselves more predictable to the other, which is a terrifying prospect, because I don't know what you think that I might do. And if I start thinking about what you think I might do, we're kind of in this state of nature, like Hobbes described, of like diffidence, of like constantly trying to assume what the other is going to do. And it also leads, I think, to a very neurotic state of being. I think that what we've seen in the past few years is, I mean, I know people have said things like mass formation psychosis, and this is kind of a little bit psychiatric for me. The terminology is too medical, but I think we have seen a kind of general, almost ideological psychic breakdown in the past 2 years, which isn't just abstract. It's not just like, oh, well, you like capitalism, I like communism, so we're going to argue about it on some Discord server or something. Like a genuine like my uncle wants me to get vaccinated, and would he rat me out to the fucking police? You know what I mean? Like, it's really like, you know, embedded in your own, like, should the situation emerge, like, who's really your friend, who's really your enemy? It's kind of Schmittian anxiety we're all living through for the past few years. And of course, cancel culture was the kind of was an earlier version of that. Everyone was terrified if they say the wrong thing, someone's going to, you know, everyone's going to turn on them and so on. We're kind of living almost in these kind of micro states of nature, of this complete psychological instability, which is roughly related to our political beliefs, because we don't really have a sort of unification. We can't really trust each other. I'm not saying we shouldn't trust each other. We should be able to, but you know, it's very clear that we can't. And I think when we can't, we start trying to, in a sense, castrate the other, to use kind of psychoanalytical terms. We start to sort of, I want to make you as predictable as possible. I want to make you as conformist as possible, not because I want you on arm in arm on my side, so towards some great cause, but just because I don't bloody trust you. You know, that's the kind of state we're in today.
Yeah. And I think this comes again. It comes back to ethics, like you said, with people's reasons for doing things. And again, I keep bringing it up, but I do think it comes back to metaphysical belief, because, you know, like we said, the terrorist has got his metaphysical reasons for doing what he's doing, these convictions. The school shooter has you know, metaphysical nihilism with a sort of a psychic hatred of the human race, or whatever reason. Yeah, getting too psychological for my knowledge, but then you have the converse of that, is like things you might think is desirable, like the spirit of forgiveness, and that comes from a Christian metaphysic, and that's ethics right there. That's the whole thing. Is and one of the issues with the scientific eschatology is that not only does it sort of deny the is-ought distinction, but it also asserts somehow contradictorily that you can have those sort of hard ethical views from a completely objective point of view. I think the thing about the ethical views is they're really not objective at all. And I think the impetus to control and conform comes from the fact that I think in a world where nothing is seen ethically, but that everything's seen empirically, that you actually don't have a reason to trust someone else, because they're almost entirely driven by economics or fashion or something like that. Like, again, like you said, the reasons for people conforming, like, they're like, well, don't you want to go on holiday in the summer? Like, don't you want to go out for a drink with your mates if they introduce vaccine passports and all this sort of stuff? It's not, it's the reason for the ethical reasons aren't even appealed to anymore. It's always economic or fashion reasons, or status reasons, which is the travel thing, I think.
Yeah, no, this breakdown of metaphysics, as you were saying, it's a few things. It's a breakdown of metaphysics. It's a breakdown of religious unity. I think it's a breakdown of, obviously, of the family. Although I think the family is constantly obsessed over for some reason today, and the other, like we fail to also acknowledge things like national citizenship, which has been, there's been an attempt to replace national citizenship with a kind of bio pass or a kind of bio credential. And I think this will ultimately fail. I don't think they will be able to do it, but there's an attempt nonetheless. And all of our kind of concepts, whether they're historical, whether they're deeply metaphysical or they're eschatological, all of our concepts of like a shared good, a shared meaning, a shared purpose, and a shared direction, I think is important too. It break down, and as you were saying, you kind of end up with this is total paranoid suspicion of everyone. And it's not even that that's irrational. Like, there legitimately is no reason to stand side by to kind of have someone's back, to stand side by side with them and so on. So it's not totally irrational to be paranoid today, because you are acknowledging that there is a loss of a kind of unified sense of direction, purpose, courage. So it's not totally irrational to be paranoid, I don't think. But at the same time, I suppose we should say maybe there should be a shared sense of something, because if there isn't, then we will end up in this kind of therapeutic conformity and micromanaging each other's behaviors, trying to constantly signal to each other, I'm your friend, don't worry, I use this language. I've taken the right pill, I've used the right rhetoric, I've read the manuscript. Yeah.
But what is that reduction to just economic concerns in combination with signaling of fashion, which is what I would call virtue. So I don't even think it's got a connection to ethics at this point. What is that but a strange postmodern version of the Hobbesian state of nature? I really think they're the same.
Yeah, I think that. Yeah, I think that's a very
less overt violence, right?
That's perfect. That's a perfect analogy for it. It's a Hobbesian, it's a postmodern Hobbesian state of nature. Exactly. It's exactly as you were saying, because it's not based on this kind of like glory-seeking warfare. It's based on very, very, very strange kind of empty, superficial fashion trends, fads, careerism, petty social competition, and so on and so forth. At least with the traditional state of nature, you could say that it's at least redemptive in the sense that you could say that at least a kind of heroism may have formed from it. Like, you're in a state of nature, everything's chaotic and horrible, but through that struggle, you learn to, have some sort of solidarity or unity or an ethical compass, and you emerge out of it. Where I don't see our post, because I think Hobbes posited the state of nature exactly so we can then propose the civil society. But I don't think the postmodern state of nature has anything to posit in its turn. It seems to just be a kind of like, it kind of takes on a very like managerial form, where it's kind of like it's not like, here's the crisis and we have to get out of it. It's like, here's this indefinite crisis, or this like constantly postponed state of emergency and so on. We just have to kind of adapt to it in a sense, which is another theme I think which is important, is that like, I think that the technological potentials for things like brain sciences, biogenetics, pharmaceutical influences on people's minds, the kind of psychological and physiological states that we experience and live in, I think that they can, in a sense, be micromanaged to put us into this kind of like Hobbesian state. Like Hobbes's idea of a state of nature was obviously something that was like kind of, say, pre-enlightened, or maybe pre you could imagine like I don't know, like the year 750 in Britain, where you had Northumbria and you had somewhere else and you had somewhere else, and there wasn't a unified state. There wasn't the concept maybe of unified religion. I'm not sure there would have been back then. And you have this lack of unification, but you're kind of forced just through the experience of life and history to overcome it. But I think that the danger we're in today with this postmodern state of nature, as you put it, is that we kind of have the mechanisms and tools to kind of just constantly postpone and constantly just adapt ourselves to live inside of it. And even this technology is perhaps an example of that. Like, instead of being around each other because we don't trust each other anymore, we can just kind of live in our little pods, and we can deal with each other in that kind of very distant and filtered way.
Yeah, and I think the not only valorization, but the kind of economic necessity of conformity is necessarily going to invoke a positive ethic of cowardice, because to have any sort of principle, you have to have a point at which you're going to rebel, where the point at which you're not going to conform. And again, this goes back into the way it's economic, and it's got its ties to capital in a kind of Nick Land-Deleuzian way, is that there's this when it is, as this keeps progressing, there's this positive feedback loop that's going to keep encouraging that the conformist biology, the conformist psychopolitics, all these things are going to get further and further encouraged. And again, I think that sort of brings up the importance of being able to escape this, to be honest with you.
Yeah, no, this is actually very good. This is exactly that. The situation we're in today is not simply like, we can't just rely on events happening to overcome. We have to, in a sense, think about how do we transform ourselves in a way. I don't mean this in a cheap self-improvement way. I don't mean this in a technical way. But maybe I was talking to Joshua Hansen like last week, and we were saying, does there need to be a kind of renaissance in virtue? And he was saying like vice is is like vice is a virtue today. Vice is the thing which is rewarded. So in a way, maybe to get out of this, we need to start thinking about like, well, how do we stop this feedback loop, as you were saying, this kind of rewarding the mechanisms which reward this kind of cowardly side and so on. And I think that for me, modern medicine really needs to be taken a good, long, hard look at today, because I don't know the amount of people that I know, just on a kind of anecdotal level, that just don't want to take responsibility or do things, and then so use a kind of particularly a psychological illness. I'm not saying they don't have these psychological problems. I'm just saying it like the identification with a psychological illness, for example, or like a disability, or a kind of like over identification with your historical victimhood and so on, this is rewarded today to such an extent that we're kind of cultivating people that are going to recreate the very conditions which keep us in this postmodern Hobbesian state to begin with. And I don't, as you're saying, I don't think this is just, it's like I even hear like, Zizek, someone saying, we need more catastrophes to shake us out of this. And I'm like, catastrophes are not alone going to shake us out of this. Like we need, like they may just make things worse. Actually, they may just reinforce this feedback loop even more. Something else I think needs to happen, which is kind of maybe a different topic, but I think it's a part of psychopolitics, which is a kind of like, again, to go back to Sloterdijk, he would refer to this as like anthropotechnics, the kind of techniques of human cultivation. How do we cultivate ourselves? Perhaps a kind of like rebellious anthropotechnics, which gets us out of this feedback loop, would be like, if you were to ask me where's hope, I would say that's where it is.
Yeah, well, I don't know. This has been pretty fantastic. I really enjoyed the psychopolitics essay, which I'll link in the description. It's on your Substack. You've also got a YouTube channel where you're having discussions. I think the psychopolitics essay is particularly good, and I think it's for reasons that you sort of preface it with that, oh, this isn't that academic, it's not that sort of precise. But I feel like in the early stages of thinking about these things, it's in my experience better to keep things a little bit loose to allow things to move as they form. So I really enjoyed it, and I hope you sort of write more on the subject, because I thought it was really good. You mentioned obviously Sloterdijk's a big influence on you. If you, and this is for my own benefit really, if you had somewhere to start with him, a book to recommend or an essay, what would you suggest?
Rules for the Human Zoo is a very good essay if you're interested in biogenetics, something he referred to as the uber humanist, which was like the opposite of the Ubermensch, which is basically someone who may use technology in kind of in this therapeutically conformist sense we've been discussing, may use kind of technologies in this way. So we need to start thinking about how we use them. It's a good, because it's a short enough essay, so it's a good entry point into them. I think if you're really interested in a more like grounded Platonic understanding of the idea of thumos, which is like what I've kind of become really interested in the past year or two, Rage and Time is a very good book, and it's very contemporary as well. So that would also be a recommendation.
Yeah, that's one of the benefits of reading someone like him is the bloke's still alive, right? He's still knocking about.
Yeah,
which isn't the case for most things that people are interested in. I don't out of interest, what are your other sort of main influences philosophically or politically?
Zizek was a big influence for a long time. I mean, he still is. Although I think that certain aspects of his work is perhaps I'm seeing kind of limited. But I think thinking psychopolitically, I think maybe he's also a good starting point, because he does get you to think. He does kind of infuse psychoanalytic theory with philosophy, with political critique, ideological critique, in a way which I think has been of huge benefit to people like me or whoever else that wants to kind of do a kind of more fresh version of ideological critique and so on. Paul Virilio is I've only come across him recently. He's quite good. Older philosophers, thinkers, I've been very influenced by Plato. Hobbes to a limited extent, Nietzsche. Who else? Probably those three mainly. I mean, like in context of this conversation anyway, I think Plato, Hobbes, Nietzsche are three very important people to understand psychopolitics.
Yeah, it's been a good conversation because it seems like from your influences, there's not a lot of overlap in what you and I have read, which is good. Zizek's one I've been putting off for so long, which is funny because I've actually seen him speak in person. So it's just like, but for him, it's particularly difficult to know where to start because he's very prolific.
I've actually also I've seen him in person. I met him. Funny story just about that. I gave him a book to sign, and I said, write something vulgar, just write something obscene, just add, like, don't just write like Slavoj. And I think he was afraid to offend me because I have a feeling this has happened before, where he wrote like, people like, fuck your mother, blah, blah, blah. And then someone like told on him to the fucking admin of the college or whatever. So he wrote, up yours, jerk. But he ripped the page as he wrote it with the pen. So I think he was like repressing him saying "fuck your mother" in the ass. So he he expressed that through ripping the page. So I have a book with Slavoj Žižek, up yours, jerk, rip.
That's perfect. That's great. So yeah, I don't know. I feel like these conversations can get a bit serious sometimes. So I don't know. I like to kind of finish, maybe not on an upper, because definitely not an upper, but something a bit more tongue in cheek, which is that if you were on death row, what would your last meal be?
Oh my god, that's a horrific question. Oh Jesus.
I'm keeping it vulgar.
Yeah, that's good. I see, the thing is, the chicken wings comes to mind, but I eat those the whole time. So it's like, why am I going to eat something I always eat? I want to eat something different. I have you ever seen Law Abiding Citizen?
No.
He gets a T-bone steak and he kills the prison guard with a T-bone steak and escapes. So I'm gonna go for T-bone steak.
Last ditch effort. I like it. That's good. That's good. Cool. Well, thanks, Owen.
Yeah, no, it's been fantastic. Thanks for having me on.